Hello.
Hey Mitch.
Hello, how are we doing?
Very well, thanks. How you doing?
Yeah, very good, very good. How are we both doing up in Edinburgh?
Yeah,
Good.
good. It's a nice day up here. Nice view of the castle as we were chatting about earlier. So yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's lovely.
Yeah, very jealous of that view.
I've got a nice view of a different castle. So, where Scotland is so full of castles that wherever you roam,
Yeah, and I have a view of kids' toys everywhere, so not quite as good. So thanks for joining today. Thank you everyone for joining the call. We're going to kick off two quick housekeeping notes. If you'd like to submit a question, please do that at any time in the chat function. Also, just a note, this is recording, so obviously don't share anything super sensitive. And if you do have more specific questions you'd like to ask after, feel free to do that just via email. Let's jump in, do some very quick introductions. So I'm Mitch, I'm Director of Revenue at Trust Keith. I host our monthly webinar series as part of that, which has been going for 2 years now. So we've been going for a while. For those who don't know, Trust Keith is a business that helps data-centric scale-ups become and stay compliant with data regulations. We do this by providing our customers with an embedded data protection expert that's kind of embedded into your team, who kind of guides the complex and high-risk work. And they are backed up by our privacy management platform that provides you with an operating system to manage global privacy compliance. I'm joined by two fabulous guests today. Kaylee, over to you for a very quick intro.
hello, I'm Kaylee Logan Cleghorn. I am the lead DPO at Trust Keith. So I have the pleasure and the privilege of leading our team of experts across our customer accounts. My background is that I've been working in data protection for since just before the GDPR, so it's been a while now. And before that, I was in operations. So my previous role was as the head of ops and data protection for an international NGO.
Thank you, Kaylee. And we are also joined by Ben. Ben is Head of Privacy and Legal Engineer at Wordsmith AI, also author of GDPR for Startups and the host of the podcast Subject Access. Ben, love a quick intro from yourself and would love to hear a bit more about Wordsmith AI as well.
Hey, thanks, Mitch. Yeah, so similar to Kaylee, my background in privacy started just before GDPR, and I've worked as a privacy lawyer since then and have moved around a few different tech businesses before now moving more onto the kind of legal engineering side. So effectively building products for privacy teams and for privacy lawyers using AI to help speed things up. And hopefully we'll be able to touch on a few of those things today. Um, yeah, so Wordsmith AI is basically a legal in-house platform, an AI platform for in-house lawyers. And it is a full suite of different tools, everything from reports, which you can use to help build your ROPA or do a kind of analysis of DPAs, to tools which are useful for writing out your DPIAs and using AI to assist with that. So there's loads of use cases, and I'll probably, as we go through, because a lot of the stuff I do day to day is using AI, as well as talking about doing DPIAs on AI. I will probably talk about how you can use AI to do DPIAs as well.
Nice. We've got the dream team on. Love it. And also just maybe before we jump in, a bit of context on the topic for today. So we done an analysis of all of the where our in-house DPOs were spending most of their time, and DPIAs I think was up in it was in the top three. So that to us obviously validates that DPIAs are an incredibly important component of running any privacy program. You combine that with the number of AI tools that are being used across everyone's businesses. Obviously, that number is skyrocketing. And then we also just regularly saw like a bit of a lack of clarity around when and how to run DPIAs effectively. And so this webinar topic was born. And that's what we're going to jump in today. Kaylee, would you mind kicking us off by just briefly giving us a bit of context so we can start all the way from the start? What is a DPIA?
That's the point where I always lose my mute button. Sorry about that.
All
Yeah,
right.
so a DPIA, for everyone here, because everyone in data protection loves to talk in acronyms all of the time, as do people in many industries. But DPIA is basically a data protection impact assessment. So what it is a structured assessment that's used to understand how systems, including AI systems, like to identify like specific risks to individuals' rights, evaluate risks and options to reduce those risks. So specifically specifically for AI, a DPIA really should consider the impact on individuals, transparency, which can be really tricky when it comes to AI because of the issue with explainability, and any automated decision making. We were just talking about castles a second ago, and it kind of occurs to me that you can think about like there's a bit of a castle analogy. I do love a silly analogy, right? So like when you're building a castle, you want to think about the weak points, like what are the hidden entries? How could an attacker get in? Like what inside the castle would cause the most danger if it was exposed or taken? And so, what people can use side doors or threats. And, essentially a DPIA is doing that kind of assessment. You're looking at your castle, you're looking at your walls, you're looking at its defenses, and you're thinking like, how can I make this safer? Depending on the organization, there's sometimes a challenge where people just don't know what a DPIA is. They don't know why they should care. They don't know why it's required. I've worked in previous organizations with like really high turnover. That means that processes just get lost if they're not built into workflows. And that makes the importance of ensuring that privacy function is as close to the operations of the business as possible. You're on mute, Mitch.
Sorry. Thank you for the context. Ben, anything you would just like to add to that before we talk about timing of when to do DPIAs?
Yeah, I think to my mind, looking at like why we do DPIAs, I think the really important thing is thinking about the idea that it's to gain an understanding of the product or the vendor or the processing or kind of whatever you're looking at, whatever you're considering, and actually doing that impact assessment on. So I think it's also quite a useful function from my experience being in-house of if the privacy teams I've been a part of, the burden of chasing down the business and getting them to actually answer your questions and tell you about products, that burden's often sat with us. And it's quite helpful almost as like creating like a standardized way of doing that. And also by having this format, you can kind of force that function in the sense of you can go and have your chat, but you can say, hey, we've got these questions that we need to answer. So it can be a really good way to frame conversations with stakeholders and gives you like a kind of formulaic process almost to follow with them. And conversely, if in some more established organizations, or if you're a small organization who's got data protection in a good place already, if it's the business team that has the kind of burden, let's call it, of doing the DPIA, then it gives them a kind of neat process to follow rather than them going, okay, well, here's a blank sheet of paper. I don't know, I've got to write a risk assessment. How do I do that? So I think working with that, you could perhaps have questionnaires, things like that to help guide them. But it basically creates this nice, a more formulaic approach than just keeping everything open-ended. I think just kind of on that, the key thing from my experience, the benefits of these is that you just have those conversations with stakeholders, with the business, with vendors, whoever it might be, which I think is actually the most important thing here. And I think my view, perhaps, that there's probably a number of your customers on here who are working with you. Some are doing parts of these internally. I imagine all of them are going to be very stretched. So for me, it's often making sure you're doing the thinking is the important thing. If the actual document isn't completed prior to a product going live or prior to something happening, it's not ideal, but to me, it's not the end of the world. Because the key thing is that you've done the thinking, you've got your rough notes and you're just waiting to write that up. So yeah, I think I would always say that just the benefit comes from the conversations and the thinking rather than having a document that you file away on Google Drive and never look at again. And one point I said I was going to talk about AI and how DPIAs are changing. So like to the question of what a DPIA is, I think previously it would have been always that conversation. You do a bit of a write up, you do the review, you do the back and forth of the impact assessment, and then you finalize it and you have that. For me, the future is going to be in some cases that will be the right way to do it, but there will also be a move with more use of AI where people can be taking those documents, and adding them into an LLM, and there will be then more time spent on fixing the issues and kind of issue spotting, and less time on the write up and kind of pulling all of the different strands out. So I think the whilst the why is still going to be assessing the impact, the what and the how it's going to happen is probably going to evolve over the next few years.
Nice. I guess the important bit there is making sure that you preserve the opportunity to speak with your members of your
Yeah,
team. That's the bit that you don't want the AI to replace, right?
yeah, and absolutely. And I think the thing that's cool with AI in this particular use case is that it will free people up more to spend more time doing that stuff, and that's where the benefit comes from. There's a lot of talk of strategic thinking and whether that's, can lawyers or privacy professionals spend all their day doing strategic thinking, but ultimately the thinking they should be doing is exactly the stuff, talking to people in the business, understanding what's going on, finding those issues, and then fixing them.
Yeah. Kaylee, anything you'd like to add there? If not, I can move on to the next section.
Yeah, I mean, just specifically on that, the evolving how of doing DPIAs and the use of AI. It it's such an interesting topic. Everyone is looking at AI at the moment. All businesses and all sectors, whether or not they want to admit it, are looking at AI and thinking like, how can we make efficiencies? How can we save time? How can we make things easier? And this is one use case that I think is really interesting, because if you can take away the sort of legwork that goes into a DPIA, because like some of it is legwork and it is not critical thinking, and you
Mm.
can free up the space to actually do the critical thinking. So there's like those two types of thinking. There's the easy thinking, and then there's the harder critical thinking. Like this is a rare use case where AI is actually like helping you to do the harder thinking rather than
Yeah.
encouraging you to go down the easy route, and that's got to be a good thing.
Yep, that makes sense. So, Ben, would you mind giving us a bit of context on when it makes sense to do a DPIA?
Yeah, so I think there's the rules are whenever there's high risk processing. But for me, again, just hammering home this conversation piece and building those relationships within the business, it feels like the the when you should do a DPA should really be determined by the privacy team or by whoever's responsible for the governance. So I think that decision should always sit with the team. But in terms of when to like kick off the process, I think in all organizations there will be some awareness. You might have people who know that like a bit about data protection and know that they should go and reach out to the privacy team when there is they're doing something like, I don't know, HR are doing something new with data. So that might be a good time to reach out. But I still think that in many quite mature organizations and startups as well, there's probably a lack of awareness about when to carry these things out. And I think that kind of the purpose of this webinar, Mitch, what you were saying at the start, kind of shows that. And like ultimately, if you're not a privacy professional, it's not your job to know about that, right? So I think it's kind of incumbent on the privacy or AI governance teams or whatever you call them in your organization to lead the charge here. In my experience I used to work at Trustpilot, and I was there for about 4 years. There was a journey before I joined, and there was a lot of work done to kind of get privacy to the table in these big discussions, and like get people to reach out to you when they should be. That continued on massively throughout the 4 or so years I was there. So I think it's something as well that people like. It's um, not an overnight process. And I'm in touch with the team still, and I hear like it's maturing and things are growing brilliantly. So it seems like one of those things that actually you have to view over in years rather than weeks. But there are ways to speed it up and like use it, having champions in the business or making things much easier for people to remove that kind of uh, burden or effort on their part means it's more likely to get people to buy in. So they will come to you, and then you can still make that decision. I think just again on that AI point, my view of actually, if your current process and but Mitch, from speaking to you, it sounds like your customers might not be the the people who have this kind of risk appetite, but if you're going to your business or your stakeholders within the business and saying, here's 200 questions we want you to fill out so we can complete our DPIA, that will probably, there'll be some heavy sighing going on and people aren't going to want to be doing that. So I think if you can kind of use AI to speed that process up of like, give me the documents, I will create a first draft. We then have a conversation and we can talk from there. That's going to be a way to still keep control of when you do that DPIA, but it will reduce the burden on people, which will, I think, be a virtuous circle because over time they're going to say, well, it's really easy to do that DPIA thing. We know we've got to do it in our process. Let's go and chat to the privacy team.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Kaylee, any thoughts? And I think particularly I'm keen to hear your thoughts around like making, and this is a bit of a broader conversation, but the journey of getting to data protection to have a seat at the table. Because obviously I feel like that is the foundation of making sure that you know when to do a DPIA and can do DPIAs at the right time.
Yeah, I mean it's like it's a journey, right? It's a journey often and not always a destination. Um, just specifically on like when you do a DPIA, we've kind of touched on this a couple of times, but like ideally ahead of time, right? You want to be doing it
Yeah.
before your processing starts, really, if you can, even if you haven't, like as Ben referred to, even if you haven't like formalized it, you definitely at least want to make sure that someone's having a conversation about these things. What I have seen very often is like DPIAs that someone realizes they should have done a DPIA and then it's being done like months after the event when the product's already been rolled out or the processing's already happening, and then it becomes more about the kind of retroactive justification, which is not really where you want to be. If a DPIA is being done after the event, you still need to make sure that you're doing that full analysis and you're thinking about it critically. And if every DPIA you do never results in any recommendations or any changes, you're probably doing your DPIAs wrong. That you should have some changes coming out the back of these things. Like Ben has already spoke about the fact that the conversation is arguably like the most important part. So the key for me is setting up a privacy function, and whatever that means in your business, whether you've got a full privacy function or whether it's an ops person like tearing their hair out and trying to do 12 things at the same time, setting that function up so that you can support those conversations and so that you are approachable, people know how to find you, even if they don't know exactly what the process is, they know how to find you and talk about it. um, but ultimately building a process that is pain-free and that recognizes that people are not always going to remember it, that recognizes that people are going to forget that this is not their job most of the time. So if you can build it into existing workflows, if you're building a product, if you can build a check for when you should be doing a DPIA into your product workflow, and it becomes part of the reg, then that's amazing. But also, like the culture piece is huge, right? For all data protection. And this kind of speaks to your question, Mitch, about like data protection getting a seat at the table. Like DPIAs are not everyone's favorite task, and they never will be. I mean, they're definitely not if you've got a 900-page DPIA that you're asking people to go and fill in and it's going to take them 3 days. It needs to be light touch. But even if it is light touch, it's still not going to be most people's favorite thing to do. So you need to talk about why it's important, and you need that cultural awareness of data protection within your business. Like, why are we doing this? Like, just to go back to my kind of castle analogy, like, why is it important? Well, if the walls fall down, the English are going to get in and we've got a problem here, so sorry. I just realized that was really quite, anyway, I'm in Scotland. What am I going to tell you? So it's always the English attacking our castles here. We that's, you need to know why it's the problem, so that cultural piece of data protection. And it is important that data protection have a seat at the table. It is a difficult thing to achieve, but like for me, the way to do that is by talking to the things that make it important. So why should people care? And I might think that they should care because data protection is awesome and everyone should think it's awesome and it's really important. But like, why should your leadership care? What is going to be the thing that is the trigger for them? Like, it's probably not the fact that the ICO are going to find them, let's be honest. Like, it's the reputational damage to the business, or it's the loss of trust of a customer, or it's what's going to happen to that wee old lady in Pennycook when her, like data goes missing. You need to think about those human stories and how to relate it both to everyone in your organization, but specifically to your leadership so that data protection does become something that gets a seat at the table.
Yeah, that makes sense. Where I see the penny drop when working across our customer base is one, once you've got leadership buy-in to what impact data protection is going to have on the outcomes of your business. If that works at the top, then all of these things start trickling down over time. So if we get that right, this will become easier. Nice, that makes sense.
Could I just touch on a point that Kelly made about the getting like speaking the language of the business? Because I think that's like one of my number one sort of cliche catchphrases that I like. Well, not it's not a cliche, but I say it a lot. Is yeah, like needing to speak the language of the business, because I think there's as in addition to like people in the business not really caring about fines necessarily until they happen. I think particularly when speaking to senior level people, if you're in a scaling business that's going through funding rounds, having data protection in good order, it makes funding conversations a lot easier. And if people haven't thought of um, haven't considered data protection, as and when a funder asks the question, it immediately loses trust there. I think the other thing is, and I've seen this a lot in my experience. I worked at Trustpilot, which was a SaaS business, so you're selling to B2B customers, and similarly here, a lot of those businesses will not engage unless they're comfortable and feel like they can trust you with their data, because ultimately, if they're a controller, they are in charge of that data. They're on the hook if things go wrong. So I think being able to demonstrate that and show that you've considered high risk processing when doing impact assessments, and you've got your privacy policy, all the other everything much broader than just DPIAs, it really can really help with those sales conversations as well.
Yep, definitely agree. And I think if we look at where our DPO's time goes, I mean, one's on DPIAs, and then probably at the top of that list is due diligence from either investors or
Yeah,
customers.
yeah.
And particularly when it comes in from investors, it gets very serious very quickly. Yeah, Kaylee's laughing. She probably spends half her time supporting the team on that. Kaylee, on that note, are there any other like kind of considerations you'd like to add on the on DPIAs?
Yeah, so I mean, like thinking about DPIAs, AI specific DPIAs, like ultimately a DPIA is a data protection impact assessment, right? Just because you're talking about AI does not change the fact that you are assessing the data protection impacts. And everyone gets really caught up, and AI is the sexy thing, and we're also excited about AI, but like ultimately the GDPR remains king. If it's personal data, the same rules apply. The medium is not the message in this instance. Like AI is the medium, but the message is data protection rules remain the same. Like the thing that maybe changes where it's AI specific is that you need to start thinking about like decisions and outcomes that can be influenced, which is potentially slightly different. What happens because the output of a system, even if it's maybe just advisory, like a recruitment score or something like that, are followed more often than not. So, like this addition to those core principles possibly makes the AI DPIAs slightly different. You also need to think about things like human review a little bit more, and there are some other AI specific pieces that I'm sure Ben will um, cover as we go through. But like ultimately, a DPIA is a data protection impact assessment. Like the data protection piece is key.
Yeah, makes sense. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, I think yeah, just I really like that point, Kaylee, about the fact that it's not something entirely different, and there's a lot of overlap between a DPIA, between a piece of software that you might be looking at, as whether it's AI or not. I think then in terms of the practicalities of implementing it, I think there's probably a couple of things to consider. First is whether like you want to use your existing DPIA and add on some AI related questions, or whether you want to create a separate impact assessment. And I think if you have a lot of resources, it might be that you want to have really detailed analysis on both. So I think there's going to be a kind of a trade-off of wanting to do separate assessments, really detailed on both, or if you have a higher risk appetite, fewer resources, then there might need to be some compromise and use your existing DPIA and kind of bolster it with some AI questions. So, Kaylee, were you going to say something, or did I just get a...
Nope, sorry, just coughing.
No. Oh, okay, cool. Great. And then I think, as Kaylee said, as well, prior to her coughing fit, was a really good point around, like, it's not specific issues that you need to kind of think about only in the context of AI, but there are a lot of things you should or will already be thinking about with your DPIAs. So I think if you've got this process set up, you've probably got a lot of the tools already in place, both from your skills as an individual, and your team, but also you've probably got some processes and documentation which can be useful. So some of the things that I think you probably want to think about are like the classic, what's happening to the input data? Who's training on it? If it's personal data, you've got an added risk there that it might be used to train models. So considering that in your process. You've got then looking at all the different processing that is happening. Now, this is a lot more difficult, I think, with an AI tool, because you could use an LLM for a wide range of purposes. So there's going to need to be a lot of thinking about that. And I'm not just going to throw out ideas here without giving any answers. I'll come to some ways I think you can distill this down in a minute. And then also looking at risks of harm, that they're probably broader with AI than with most sort of deterministic narrow tools. Thinking about automated things like automated decision making. Have you got a human in the loop? Is there someone who's looking at decisions that are being made? And of course, there's transparency as well, which is more difficult if you're using AI because it's a bit of a black box. But I still think all of these things you can probably make an informed or reasonably informed attempt at doing an impact assessment on if you use the kind of thinking and tools that you've already got. So just some of the ways that I think you can start by doing this is, first of all, looking at the impact assessment you have and what questions you might want to include there. So like, the different topics, and also looking at more broader issues. So, for example, I know this isn't directly related to a DPIA, but if you're thinking about AI impact assessment on your business, let's say, like what's happening with IP, who owns the IP to output. Also, important consideration, AI Act. Is there something that you're starting to do which might stray over into high risk processing? And that's a whole other topic, and perhaps we don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much, but I'll touch on that in a second. I've got a few thoughts about what you can do after this webinar. And then finally, if you might have some tensions there with if you're doing any training or fine tuning of models. So thinking about data minimization, if it were fine tuning a model with sensitive data, you're editing a model, you're tweaking it to your own use case. You've got, on the one hand, GDPR saying don't process more data than you need to, and then on the other hand, you're saying, well, to make the model as good as I can make it, I need to put personal data and train the model and tune it and everything. So finding that balance is going to be something you need to do the thinking on. And that's where I think that, coming back to that point we talked about at the start with the conversations with the business, I think that's where that becomes really important. Mentioned a couple of times of like, yeah, I've thrown a few things out there. How can you do some practical stuff? I was actually looking the other day at the ICO, Information Commissioner's Office, AI toolkit. And I think there are some really good it's a really good starting point for the kind of issues that you might want to consider. And that's everything from function creep, bias, data minimization, considering how you might have people misusing tools within your company, and like the complexities around data subject rights with AI. So I would say that there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done, but perhaps looking at something like that where there's a framework where you can start to get questions and do some analysis on tools in a kind of structured way would be a really good place to start. Um, yeah, I'll pause there. I spoke quite at length there about the various ways, but yeah, if there's anything else you can think I've missed there, please shout.
Well, just to note that one of our upcoming webinars will go into more detail on the AI Act, so maybe you can feel free to join us again for that one. But we're definitely going to be going into more detail there soon.
Great.
But really, any like specific observations or comments on the stuff that Ben's just spoken through?
I think Ben's done a really thorough job, but just to say, like that, the ICO AI toolkit is a really nice reference. Like those headings at least are just really good starting points to go and say, okay, well, I don't really know where to start thinking about AI. Like, give me some suggestions, and it will be quite good. It's not, the UK doesn't have an AI regulation in the same way that the EU AI Act is coming in elsewhere. But the ICO actually, for other faults that they may have, their guidance is usually pretty good.
I don't know what faults you're talking about, Kaylee. They're
Couldn't
perfect.
possibly say.
Um, Ben, any other considerations on like AI specific DPIAs before we go into a bit of an example with Kaylee?
I wonder if, yeah, I think it'd be good to go to the example, and then I can perhaps chip in about like how I might think about some of those topics or pull out some issues and apply it there.
Yeah, by all means, let's do it. Kaylee, I'm back over to you.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk us through maybe an example of the kind of thing that could happen. I came from an NGO. That was my previous role before moving to Trust Keith. So I'm pretty familiar with organisations that do fundraising. And fundraising is one of those areas where the teams are always super overstretched. They've got targets to try and meet in a cost of living crisis where people are cutting back rather than being more forthcoming. They're under a lot of pressure and they're always trying to find ways to make efficiencies. In this scenario, we're going to imagine that Trust Keith are working with this organization, and because we have a data champion from the fundraising team who's like the function lead, and we have regular conversations with them. And as part of one of these regular conversations, they have said, "Oh yeah, we're thinking about using some AI to help us make fundraising a bit more efficient." Okay, we can dig into this a bit more. So what we found out then is that they are looking for ways to introduce AI to support their fundraising, and they want to bring in a tool that analyzes their donor database to predict who's going to be most likely to donate, suggest who to contact, and maybe even make some recommendations or tone on timing of messages, potentially. And one of the things that they're looking at is even personalizing those messages for them. On the surface of it, like to the fundraising team, it sounds really simple. It sounds like it's just an efficiency tool. We've already got all of this data. We're not collecting anything new. What's the issue? But actually, like once we scratch the surface of it a little bit and just start thinking about it, but what this tool is actually doing is potentially inferring the financial capacity of some of the donors in their database. It's inferring their willingness to give. So here then, the kind of AI specific considerations that are coming up are going to be like, what is that system inferring about a person that they didn't directly tell us? And could those inferences potentially be quite sensitive? We'd also want to think about like, how do we explain this to the donor? How could we explain the decisions that it's making in a meaningful way? If that individual gets in touch and says, well, why was I contacted? Or potentially, my pal Doreen down the road has always been involved in the same fundraising as me. Why was she contacted and why was I not? Like, how can we explain that? And we also want to think about really like, was the purpose that this data was collected for like compatible with the purpose that it's actually being used for now, or that we want to use it for now? Like, so if we're now going to start using this data that we've got on donors to start predicting behavior, would the donor reasonably expect that data would be used in that way? And so this potentially really like innocuous, this is just going to bring some efficiencies into what we're doing, has a number of data protection implications that need to be like really nailed down.
Yeah, Ben?
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. Just how it's something that starts off, like you say, innocuous, and then actually you get quite a few sensitive pieces there. Yeah, I think the things that jumped out to me around like the bias of potential, if you start looking at previous donors and you use them as your kind of training data, you might, and say, find me profiles like this person, you might end up only picking from one group of people as um, your kind of donor list. And then I think there's a really key point there around trust. If you're trying to get people to donate money to you, um, you want to be able to explain things and get them to trust you. But I think it would be an interesting trade-off there of would you be upfront about your use of AI in that situation? Would you not, because you say, well, actually we don't meet the requirements, we don't need to do that by under the AI Act because it's not a high enough risk? Or yeah, that just to me feels like a really interesting trust piece. Um, yeah, I think those were the kind of the key things that stood out to me. But yeah, a cool example of that.
Nice. We've got a couple of questions. One is, does the new Data Use and Access Act soft opt-in change this if they're a new donor? Probably one for you, Kaylee.
So the soft opt-in, no, it wouldn't change whether or not you needed to do a DPIA or an AI risk assessment in this particular instance. So for anyone that's not aware, the UK GDPR has something called the soft opt-in, which is you can assume that people want to hear from you if they have purchased goods or services from you that are of a similar type to the ones that you might want to market to them. This there was always it was always very clear that this did not apply to charities. And so charities could not use the soft opt-in exemption. However, the Data Use and Access Act has opened up a type of soft opt blah, 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 a type of soft opt-in for charities. It I would this is probably a whole webinar all by itself, and maybe this is an idea for a webinar, Mitch. But
Yeah.
I would urge caution when ploughing ahead with the soft opt-in, because although it has now come into force, the ICO's guidance and the Fundraising Association's guidance on how to use this soft opt-in have not come out. The important thing to know is that it's not retrospective. You can't apply it to things going backwards. And really critically, and charities with charity shops are going to hate me for saying this, but just because someone has bought something from a charity shop, unfortunately, does not mean that you can apply the soft opt-in to do your fundraising marketing to them.
Nice. We have a couple of other questions popping up, so I'm going to run through them. Kaylee, this one's probably for you. So, how would you speak the language of the business as an outsourced DPO working with many businesses and limited access?
That's a really good question. I think it's about, with the limited amount of time that you've got, how embedded can you become and how much can you find out about the business? So, like for me, it's always about storytelling. You need to talk to the key players and find out what kind of messages are the most important to them. If they what are they most worried about? Give you your top five of what you're most worried about. But there's also a piece around being able to digest what the organization has already produced, because you'll get a sense of the tone. The tone is different and the style is different for every organization. You don't necessarily have to have loads of hours talking to people within the business. I mean, if you can, brilliant. But you don't necessarily need to have all of that to be able to get a sense of the tone and the style. But broadly speaking, there are a few like key types of risks that most people are worried about. I think that you can talk to senior leadership about the risk around customer trust, about the risk around due diligence, sometimes around the risk around, the regulation, particularly if they're in heavily regulated industries. And then being able to kind of talk to most people, I find that the most effective way to talk to most people is to talk about people. It's not to talk about regulation or legislation. And, any or most rather good data protection people don't do that. But if you get, those really generic trainings off the internet, they'll talk about, the seven key principles and the lawful bases and, no one cares. What people actually care about is like, why does this matter? And ultimately for me, it boils down to my catchphrase, which is data protection is people protection. So like tell a story about a person and tell the story about how it impacts them if this goes wrong.
Yeah. Ben, any thoughts to add on to that one around like how, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the people point, and telling stories and getting people to, yeah, I guess speaking their language and the things that they care about rather than what you care about as a privacy advocate or a person who cares about data protection. Because most people, it's like, how much if I'm doing data protection, how much time in my day am I thinking about the LinkedIn posts for the company or the marketing materials that we're sending out? It's like it's minuscule, really. And so if you speak to a marketing person, flip that around, that's the same amount they're speaking about data protection. So yeah, I think speaking people's language, and kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
not just talking about regulation all the time is a good way to get people on board.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd add to that, like when we first set out to build Trust Keith, which was like 6, 7 years ago now, one of like the really common bits of feedback we got on like the more traditional consulting space was that it often goes into this kind of reactive model where consultants maybe don't understand the business. It's not always the case, but we definitely heard that a lot. And so I think the way in which to solve for that, if you're using an outsourced DPO, because a lot of companies don't need a full-time one, is one, ensuring that the DPO you use has a tried and tested system for properly understanding your business. And that usually should be done through a combination of technology using AI tools to understand what data is processed. And then the DPO should have some sort of operating system to regularly engage with all levels of your business, like some sort of quarterly risk committee with senior leaders, and then something a bit more on the ground with people on the across the business. But it definitely is possible to get a DPO externally that understands your business enough to provide like a good, robust kind of service.
Mm.
A couple of other questions. Ben, got one for you. Interested to hear from Ben on how is building an AI native privacy program at Wordsmith AI going, and what are the latest technologies?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think for a lot of people who are in startups and scale ups, it's you are wearing multiple hats, and it's
Yeah.
a very difficult thing to do, to build a privacy program, albeit even with or without AI. My experience so far, and this is probably the same as something that the GC and myself get very excited when we're talking about, is like how we can drive efficiencies in our own work, and then build products that we can then get released into the product for other people to use. So some of the things that I've been working on at the minute are around risk assessments, so building our DPIA, legitimate interest assessments, within the product, so I can very quickly do those without having to spend lots of time doing it. So that frees up some time. Another pain point, which I think a lot of people face, is records processing activity. So again, my kind of instructions to me is like, how can you do that, just you as a solo privacy person, and do that for the business? So I've been building a tool within Wordsmith to do the record processing activity. And I think probably the third piece I touch on is around engaging with the business. So I've put a lot of time into speaking about privacy within Wordsmith, and this is both. It's actually quite a nice opportunity here because I'm speaking about it as like a product piece. So like we can use this thing, privacy, as a almost a not a sales tool, but it's like one of the products we offer to customers. So people are very, on the sales side, are very interested in it, whereas historically sales might not be so interested unless it stopped them getting a deal through. So I'm speaking about it in that context, but then I'm also saying, oh, when you're using a tool, make sure you've got training data switched off and all the kind of communications generally within the business. The thing that's nice about all these things in an organization which is growing is that I've managed, I'm lucky to have come in relatively early, so I can set those things up and I can have those conversations and get the privacy word out there and in both of those strands. So yeah, it's going well. It's difficult to balance the kind of multiple hats with doing a privacy and compliance program. But yeah, I love it. It's great. That's not
Nice.
necessarily what they're asking, whether I
Yeah.
love my job or
Do
not,
you
but
love it?
it's good fun.
Yeah, yeah. Good to know you do love it. I'm not surprised. It sounds very interesting. Couple of other questions to run through, and then we'll be able to wrap up. So, the next one, Kaylee, maybe you can kick us off on this one. Is how do you stop DPIAs becoming a box ticking exercise?
Yeah, good question. Good question, because this is a risk, right? Like if you have a DPIA, you do it, you put it in your, I mean, no one actually prints them out and puts them on paper anymore, but you put it in your paper and you stick it on the shelf and no one ever looks at it again. Like it's a pointless exercise. So the key thing for me is that it needs to form part of your privacy ecosystem. And you know, that is really important. So what you want to think about is like at the end of your DPIA, what you should really have is some recommendations. So it hopefully the recommendation is not, oh, this is terrible, just don't do it. Hopefully the recommendation is like, okay, here's a couple of things that we can do to make it safer, to make our walls stronger. So you want to make sure that something is happening with those. Like I've definitely seen instances and you know in the past been part of instances where you do a DPIA, there's a recommendation at the bottom of it, it goes back into whatever system you're using and no one ever looks at it again, no one actions it, no one follows up on it. One of the nice things about the way that we do it at Trust Keith is that we have our DPIAs built into our product workflow. At the end of it, there's the recommendations that are made, signed off, and we then bring that into your risk treatment plan, which is the quarterly plan on how we're managing the privacy framework, so that there is always visibility on that and there's some sense on when they will be actioned. You know, it might be really urgent. We want to bring it into this quarter, less urgent, bring it into a couple of quarters down the road. But however you do it, like making sure that it forms a part of your privacy ecosystems, those actions shouldn't just be sitting in a document. And the other really key piece for me is that like a DPIA isn't just a one and done. You don't go, okay, we've done the DPIA on that, put it, file it, never need to look at it again. We've assessed that system, it's fine. They should absolutely be revisited. So, like, best practice is to revisit them periodically anyway. So, you might want to set a cadence, you know, for a higher risk. Maybe you want to look at it every 6 months, every 12 months, something like that. But you should also revisit them when there is a material change. So, like thinking specifically about AI, a new model provider would be a significant enough change that I'd want to go and revisit the DPIA. But you should also start thinking about like changes in outputs and how they are used operationally. So, what I mean by that is, say, for example, you have got like a recruitment tool that you're using and it scores candidates or it gives a suggested score based on their CV against the requirements of the job description. Now, that is purely advisory, but actually what you notice over time is that no one ever questions those figures, no one digs into it any further, and it has moved away from becoming purely advisory. Now it's actually something that effectively is making a decision. So that's the kind of thing where you would want to be talking to the team about how they're actually using it, what's really happening, monitoring it, and then potentially revisiting the DPIA on that basis further down the road.
Yes, makes sense. Ben, anything you want to add in terms of how to stop DPIAs becoming like a box ticking exercise?
Yeah, I was scribbling down some notes as Kaylee was talking there. I think first of all, I think if you are the person in the business responsible for data protection, then the onus is on you to make sure that it doesn't become a box ticking exercise. And I think there's a few ways you can do that. I think the first is by getting engagement. So that is all of the stuff we've talked about, speaking the language of the business and, you know, making sure you're having those conversations. And I think if you're at a stage where your organization is ignoring you or they you know, that people aren't coming to you with stuff, that again, the onus on you is to go and build those relationships, because lots of people could write a really nice DPIA, a really good document, but if no one does anything with it, it's just a piece of paper. So I think that engagement piece is the first one. And then the next thing I would say is like being creative and coming up with practical solutions. So on the risk point, on the kind of where there are issues and things that need to be changed, being creative, working with the teams, and like coming up with a practical solution that doesn't impact the product too much, or the mean they can't sign up that vendor, but does so the DPIA is sorry, what am I saying? It doesn't impact the vendor, but it enables the business to implement something in a way which still works for them, but is also safe. And then third thing I think is iterating on the DPIA, as Kaylee said, like where processing is changing or things are changing, that should be considered. But again, I'm going to throw the use of AI in here because I use it a lot for this kind of stuff. Is you do a DPIA, you ask a load of questions, you do your risk mitigation, you then get a load of information about how those risks have been mitigated. You put that into the DPIA again, you rerun the DPIA, those risks hopefully won't be flagged again if you've built the tool correctly. And you can almost use DPIA 1 to get the risks to inform DPIA 2 and iterate as time goes on, as the product changes, as you get, I don't know, new sub-processor lists added to that vendor, whatever it might be. And you can kind of just keep iterating on that DPIA pretty quickly without it being such a major undertaking as doing everything manually.
Nice. Kaylee, anything you want to add? Otherwise, we've got one final question that's come in.
No, the thing that I would, it's not really adding, it's just like echoing something that Ben already said, which is about the importance of being able to have conversations and actually be close to different areas of the business. I know from personal experience, right? Some of us who land in data protection land there because we are not the most obvious people in the world. You know, we maybe sometimes find it a bit difficult to have those conversations, but it's an important part of the role, right? You have to, the onus, as Ben said, is on the privacy function to make sure you are close enough to the business and to make sure that you have enough trust in the business to actually be able to get the answers that you need and to make sure that those DPIAs don't turn into box ticking exercises. And if you are only ever the data protection police, you know, data protection says no, people won't have that trust. So I love the thing that Ben just said about being creative, you know, creative solutions. You can't just be a block all of the time because the trust will be gone.
Nice. Agreed. Final question is, how often would you need to run these DPIAs given some companies change their sub-processes and ways of working? Katie, do you want to take that?
I mean, I can start off. I'm sure Ben's got more to say, but yeah, like that potentially is a trigger for rerunning a DPIA. Like there is definitely, it depends on the business and it depends on the risk, but like I would always recommend revisiting DPIAs at least once annually, probably more than that if it's something risky. But if there is like a change to a sub-processor, then that might be a trigger point for revisiting the DPIA. So like as I said before, DPIAs are not one and done. You don't do them, finish them, and put them on the shelf. Like there are various things that might trigger reassessing that DPIA.
I guess like where Ben, maybe one for you, like where do you draw the line? Because if you've done 10 DPIAs and like the number of potential changes across the course of a year could get a bit out of control.
Yeah, I think it's, I'd absolutely, yeah, I think both those are good points. I'd absolutely echo what you're saying, Kaylee, about it being a kind of, that's the perfect position. I know from my own experience that an annual DPIA review across, let's say, even 20 or 30 DPIAs, that is it's a major task. So I think it has to be taken in the wider context of everything else you're doing in the privacy program. If you like, you never, you don't want to have a tail wagging the dog situation where you say we've got an annual DPIA review. We're not going to be able to review that new product going live or that vendor that you want to look at for 6 months. Not only will you damage your relationship in the business, but also you potentially expose yourself to bigger risks because there's stuff going completely under the radar whilst you're making these very good DPIAs, but not actually covering the majority of things. So in my experience, all privacy teams are pretty stretched. So if you can do an annual review or you can note that there's been an update to sub-processes and you had a quick look at the terms and they were okay, then brilliant. But I would say that don't get too stressed about it if you aren't able to do that, providing you're doing some useful stuff to mitigate risk.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking in the 5 years I've been at Trust Keith working in privacy, I don't know if I've ever met an internal data protection team that feels like they have enough time. So
Okay.
probably
Yeah.
everyone on here.
You've got a bigger sample size than me, I think, as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah. Well,
that's
I
good to
haven't.
know.
No.
I
Kaylee's
don't think
got,
it's limited just to data protection, though. It's an internal anything team, right?
Yeah, of
Everyone,
course.
all
yeah,
teams
true.
is overstretched. We've all got too much to do. And like, yeah, in an ideal world, let's absolutely revisit those DPIAs annually. I would definitely do it on a risk-based approach. What are the riskier ones? And then specifically on that piece around sub-processors, well, like what's the risk of swapping out a sub-processor? If it is literally like for like, then the risk is probably quite low. If it's like a sub-processor that, has alarm bells ringing for whatever reason, you're swapping out for something that has had multiple data breaches or has had multiple issues, then yeah, maybe there's more risk there. But as with DPIAs, as with everything, should be done on a risk-based approach.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to wrap up. It's probably a really effective guiding principle if you're ever stuck on anything in data protection is focus on where the risk is like highest, and then usually that's where to go. So on that note, let's wrap up. Ben, thank you so much for joining. Kaylee, thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. We'll be sending around the recording, and I will include kind of options for you to reach out to Ben or Kaylee in that email as well, for you to reach out with questions. So much appreciated, and I'll see you next month.